Hey guys, this is Neil. Welcome back to my channel. Today I will be adding to the herb series and I'm going to be painting the herb thyme. This is fairly simple, very similar to rosemary's but with shorter and smaller leaves. I'm going to start by drawing out the leaves first in different directions. These are basic leaf shapes but very small and it curves in different ways and form clumps. We're not going to draw too much for this one because I find that this one is quite straightforward and you'd be able to see the steps more clearly when we paint. Try to draw the leaves with different curves, as many as you can figure out as a start if you need to warm up before you paint. I'm also going to show you how the leaves are placed on the stem. They generally grow in clumps and because they're so small, and find sometimes some of the leaves fall out, so we can leave gaps in the group of leaves. Sometimes you can even draw the leaf by itself. When you're drawing out the leaves in groups, also try to figure out which leaves are placed in front or behind, and this should help create the form of the leaves to look a bit more 3D. The stem can also branch out, and when they do, it can be both long or short. As an example, I'm going to draw a fairly long stem branching out, but little ones can also bring about interest to the composition of the painting. Towards the bottom of the stem, I also try to draw the leaves a bit more sparse, but this is not always the case, so do according to your taste and according to something that would benefit the composition of your painting. I'm going to quickly move on to the colors now. I'm going to first swatch the colors for the stem. For the base of the stem, I use a mixture of permanent yellow deep and permanent green, or any light lime green color you have. And as definition or shadows, I'm going to add permanent green 2, which is basically a darker version of the same green in my Holbein set, or you can use a darker value of a similar green that you have. When these herbs dry out, the stem turns a brown color, so you can use burnt sienna for the stem too, but for this painting I'm going to make the thyme look like it's fairly fresh, so I'm going to do a slight browning at the bottom of the stem only. Moving on to the leaf colors now, I'm going to keep this one fairly flexible. You can use sap green for the base of the leaves or mixture of permanent green 2 and permanent yellow deep to tone down the bluish green. And as the shadows or darker tone of green, I'm going to use hooker's green, which has a really nice deep and rich tone to the green color. I'm going to show you what a combination of these colors will look like. Even though the colors are fairly limited, you can do a lot by just adding different consistencies to create beautiful tonal values. Here is just the texture of the leaves with a flat composition, so you can see where I would place the dark tones. So for the base color of the leaves, I use the mixture of permanent green 2 mixed with permanent yellow deep. But if you don't want to mix the colors, you can also just use sap green. I always start with a light base color as we're going to build up the layers, which means there's a high ratio of water compared to paint. For the darker tones, I mixed in hooker's green and sap green, and I color where I see the leaves are placed at the back, or even to define certain folds of the leaves. I first use a medium consistency, then adding to a thicker consistency with more of the hooker's green in the mixture when I want to define the darker tones. I'm also going to show you different greens here that you can use. If the green that you have on your palette is fairly cold, you can warm it up by adding warm yellow into the color to warm the temperature and vice versa. And here I'm swatching different tones you can create just from the limited colors that we're going to use. Before I begin to paint, especially for paintings with no outlines, I usually like to do a thumbnail sketch of the composition, just so the process can be less intimidating when you're faced with a blank piece of paper. At this stage, you can also erase and figure out which areas you want to be more heavy with the focal point, or what to place in certain areas to balance the painting as a whole. For me, this stage is crucial, however, I will only be using this as slight reference. You don't have to follow the drawing to a T because sometimes as you paint, the brush strokes might end up in different places, which would make the balance of the painting a bit different to the initial sketch, but I use this as an overall layout for the painting as a whole, rather than for all the details. This is the rough image that I have in my head, but if you would like to play around with more compositions, you can do a few of these until you're happy with the layout. I'm happy with this layout, so I'm going to start painting. To set the layout, I'm going to start by painting the big stems first, and because we're going to paint the leaves on top of the stem, I'm starting with a really light color from the mixture of permanent green and permanent yellow deep, with a really light consistency, which means a lot of water compared to paint. Once I'm done with the main stem, then I'm going to add the branches. I'm not going to go overboard with this because the leaves will be fairly detailed. Then I'm going to add the small broken branches on each of the sides as accents and to balance the layout. Now I'm going to build up the leaves. I'm still working with a light consistency at this point, but I'm using a slightly darker green by adding the permanent green 2 into the mix, and I'm still using my size 2 brush to paint the leaves. Do the same as when you are drawing the leaves, and remember to not overcrowd one spot. It's actually better to do less because you can always build up the volume of the leaves later, but if you put down too much detail already in the beginning, it'll become too bulky and it would actually take more effort to lighten the weight of the painting rather than to build. So the way I've painted the leaves is that I always leave a bit of white space in between the leaves. I'm not worrying about the leaves that I'm going to place at the back yet because the paint and water might travel to places you might not want it to go to if you're placing the leaves too closely together, because the paint or water will flow into any damp or wet surface on the paper even if there's only a slight touch. We're actually going to go back with a darker green later and paint the leaves that are placed at the back. So think of this as a flat painting at this point, and the key is to just leave space in between the leaves and also play with different directions and weights of the leaves so the composition looks more natural. If you're new to watercolor, it might be a bit difficult to paint at a small scale. A tip is to have your brushes looking slightly damp but not dripping wet. If your brush holds too much water and you place it down on paper, the water will flow too quickly to your paper straight away, leaving a puddle or a droplet of water, and this can easily be smudged or leave an unwanted blooming texture when it dries and make the painting look a bit messy. So if you're worried about this happening, I would recommend for you to use a smaller brush so it's a bit easier for you to control the amount of water or to paint at a larger scale. Moving on to the second layer of leaves, this is where I will use a darker tone of green, but still with a light watery consistency, as I'm just mapping out some of the leaves that are placed at the back and even doubling up on some of the leaves that I find needs to be darkened a bit. For this, I added a touch of sap green and hooker's green into the previous mixture that we used for the leaves, but the paint is still very diluted, so it can still be easily layered on top of later for the details. If you find that certain areas are looking a bit sparse, this is also the time to add some additional leaves. By using a darker green, the composition of each group of leaves won't look bulky because the color will break any of the flat silhouettes. I think I also forgot to mention that I changed my brush to a smaller one as the painting needs a bit more precision. This is a size 0 brush and it's great to get into the tiniest details between each leaves. I'm going to do this for all of the THYME stem, and then I'll get back to you again as we build on the layers of detail in the next step. Now it's time to add a touch of detail or smaller leaves. We're going to use a thicker consistency of the same mix now, and here I'm starting to add folds of the leaves by partially coloring one side or even adding some smaller leaves further at the back by adding the darker tone of green. I'm adding this dark green mostly to the back leaves that we just painted in the previous step, so you don't lose any of the lightness from the first layer because that light color will break up the bulk of the leaves. At any point, you could also increase the intensity of the green by adding more hooker's green into the mix. This way you can exaggerate some really great tonal values. I'm going back to a lighter color now, but with a thick consistency this time. I think this one is a mixture of permanent green 2 with permanent yellow deep, with more of the permanent green instead of the yellow to darken the tone a bit. And here I will add details for the first initial layer, which are the lightest leaves. This part needs some really fine brushwork because I will be adding outlines to parts that is too light compared to the white background. This way I'm going to separate the shapes by adding a very thin outline to the leaf. I'm also going to add a very thin line in the middle of wide leaves to suggest the vein. Once you're happy with the placement of the leaves and the details, we're going to work on defining the stems to bring this painting together. I'm sticking with the size 0 brush because we're basically outlining the stem, which are quite thin to begin with. I'm going to use a mixture of permanent yellow deep and permanent green 2 in a medium consistency to separate the stem and the leaves. While the leaves are looking a bit cold, I'm going to use a warmer green for the stem, so this means adding more of the permanent yellow deep so you can see a slight contrast in the color temperature. Then I'm going to use a medium consistency burnt sienna and paint parts of the bottom stem so you can see a nice transition between the warm green and the burnt sienna as the stem is slowly drying up. As a final accent to the painting, I'm going to scatter some loose thyme leaves around. I'm going straight with a medium consistency green, and I'm not going to be too worried about detail for this one, maybe a slight outline, because we don't have to worry about any grouping as these are individual flat leaves. Then using the hooker's green, I added some outline to the scattered leaves. To some I add a full outline, and to others I only do one side just to give slight variations. Before I finish my paintings, I always take a step back and look at the painting as a whole and see if I want to add any final touch-ups, because after working on fine details, sometimes we forget to look at the bigger picture, and this time I want to add some more scattered leaves, and that's the final step. So we're finished with the thyme painting. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned something new. Thank you for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!